All right, so let's dive right in. We're going deep on the conflict in Ukraine today. And wow, you've pulled together a fascinating mix of recent articles for this one.
It's a really a dynamic situation for sure. And yeah, these articles capture that, I think. They cover so much ground from the latest on the battlefield to all the diplomacy happening behind the scenes and even, the impacts rippling out across the global economy.
Yeah, it feels like every time we look at this situation, things have shifted, and with all the debate right now about whether to keep sending aid to Ukraine, understanding what's actually going on the ground feels more important than ever. One thing that really jumped out at me was this report from the Kursk region. Russia is saying they've retaken some territory and are blaming Ukrainian shelling for civilian casualties there.
The Kursk region is really interesting, I think, because it really highlights both the military and the human costs of this whole thing. You see, Ukrainian troops, they managed to establish a bridgehead there about 7 months ago, and it's been a constant problem for Russia, like a thorn in their side. They've been trying so hard to regain control, and this latest report, it suggests they might be making some progress.
Okay, so what makes this Kursk region so important strategically? Is it just about the land itself, or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more than just land. Controlling Kursk, it gives Russia a real tactical advantage. It could disrupt Ukrainian supply lines and potentially strengthen their own defensive positions. But it's also, I think, pretty symbolic, right? You have to remember, this region has changed hands so many times throughout history. A victory here for Russia, even a small one, they could spin that as a sign of strength, a sign that the momentum is shifting.
That makes sense. And what about these civilian casualties? Is there any way to know what really happened there?
Honestly, that's one of the hardest things in any conflict zone. Getting accurate information. We have claims from both sides, obviously, but independent verification is really tough, especially when there's active fighting going on. It's a stark reminder, though, that war is always messy, and sometimes the truth gets lost in all the chaos.
It is, yeah. And a reminder that everything, every action, every advance, every retreat, it all has consequences. Not just for the soldiers, but for the people living in these places.
And speaking of potential shifts on the battlefield, there are these reports that Ukrainian troops might be losing ground in some areas. I mean, what could be the thinking behind that? Could it be a sign that their defenses are actually weakening? I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. It's important to keep in mind that Ukraine is fighting a defensive war, right? And they're up against a much larger force. So they have to be incredibly strategic and resourceful. It's entirely possible that they're choosing to give up ground in certain areas, maybe to draw Russian forces in only to counterattack later. Or, maybe they're focusing their resources on defending places that are more strategically important.
So it's not always about holding on to every inch of land. It's more about picking your battles, knowing when to push and when to pull back. It's like they're playing this giant game of chess, but the stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. And like any good chess player, Ukraine has to think several moves ahead. They have to anticipate Russia's actions and adapt their strategy as things change.
And that brings us to another interesting development from these articles, those upcoming talks in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of speculation that Ukraine might propose a limited ceasefire during those discussions.
Now that's interesting. What would a limited ceasefire even look like in this situation? I mean, what would that actually entail? Well, think of it more like hitting pause, not stop, right? It wouldn't be a full peace agreement or anything, but it could give both sides some much-needed breathing room. They might agree to a temporary halt in the fighting around the Black Sea, for example. That's a crucial shipping route for grain and other goods, as you know. Or, maybe they agree to stop those long-range missile attacks on civilian infrastructure, which have caused so much devastation.
Okay, so less about ending the war outright and more about de-escalating things, at least for a little while. That makes sense. But one thing I found kind of strange was that President Zelensky might not be at these U.S.-Ukraine talks. And there's this mention of a Rostov-Kommen with the U.S. I have no idea what that even means, to be honest.
Don't worry. Rostov-Kommen is just the German word for raw materials agreement, so it's essentially some kind of resource deal, which is pretty significant given everything else going on globally right now.
Ah, okay, that makes a lot more sense. So what kind of resources are we talking about here, and what could this agreement mean both for Ukraine and for the U.S.?
Well, Ukraine has a lot of valuable resources. We're talking iron ore, coal, even those rare earth minerals that are so important for all the technology we use today. And then, of course, there's all that vast agricultural land. Now, the details of this potential agreement, those are still unclear. but it definitely suggests that the U.S. might be looking to secure access to these resources, Maybe to reduce their dependence on other suppliers, or maybe to just strengthen those economic ties with Ukraine.
So this goes way beyond just military aid. It's about resources, economic alliances, maybe even shifting power dynamics, both in the region and globally. It makes you wonder how this potential deal might play out on that bigger stage.
It really does, and that's what makes this whole conflict so fascinating, so complex. Every single move has these ripple effects, not just on the battlefield, but politically and economically too.
All right, so we've got a battlefield that keeps shifting, a potential ceasefire maybe on the horizon, and now this intriguing resource agreement. Feels like we're just scratching the surface here. We'll have to dive deeper into the global response to all of this when we come back.
Yeah, it's like watching this global chess game unfold, and everyone's making their moves, trying to figure out what the consequences are going to be, right? And speaking of the global response, these articles really highlight how the rest of the world is reacting to all of this, both in terms of the immediate aid they're sending and the long-term solutions people are talking about. One thing that stood out to me was this group of Nobel laureates calling to use frozen Russian assets for Ukrainian reconstruction.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that idea floating around.
Yeah.
And it does sound kind of compelling on the surface, right? I mean, we're talking billions of dollars in Russian assets that have been frozen because of those Western sanctions. So why not use that money to help rebuild Ukraine? Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, it's definitely appealing, especially when you see the scale of the destruction in Ukraine, but it's not as straightforward as it sounds. Seizing those assets and then using them like that, it raises all sorts of legal and ethical questions. We're in uncharted territory here, legally speaking.
Yeah. So what kind of legal hurdles would they have to clear? And what kind of precedent would this set, for future conflicts?
Well, first of all, you have to think about property rights. I mean, even though those assets are frozen, they still technically belong to the Russian government or to Russian entities. Seizing them outright would be a huge challenge under international law. And then you've got the whole issue of due process. You can't just confiscate someone's assets without a fair and transparent legal process. And then there's always the risk of retaliation. If Western countries start seizing Russian assets, what's to stop Russia from doing the same thing to Western assets held in Russia, right?
It's like this minefield of legal and diplomatic issues, and every step you take could have all these unintended consequences. But okay, let's say hypothetically they do manage to overcome those legal challenges. Would using Russian assets for Ukrainian reconstruction actually be effective? I mean, would it even work?
That's the other big question, isn't it? Even if it were legally possible, there are still all these practical things to consider. First, you have to figure out how much these frozen assets are actually worth and how easy it would be to turn them into cash. Then you have to figure out how to distribute that money fairly and efficiently for all those reconstruction efforts. Logistically, it's incredibly complex.
So it's not as simple as just taking the money and handing it over to Ukraine. There's this whole process of legal justification, valuation,
Right.
and distribution. It's a lot to figure out. And speaking of complex challenges, there's also this idea of creating an international security force for Ukraine, which one of these articles highlighted. That sounds like a game changer, potentially, but it also raises so many questions like, who would even be part of this force? Would it be something like a UN peacekeeping mission, or would it be completely different?
That's the million-dollar question, and there are no easy answers, unfortunately. The whole idea is to create a stronger deterrent against future Russian aggression. But to actually create something like that, you'd need a level of international cooperation and agreement that's, well, it's proving pretty hard to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, just look at all the debate around NATO expansion. It seems like any attempt to bolster Ukraine's security is seen as a provocation by Russia. So how do you even begin to set up an international security force without making things even worse?
It's a real dilemma, for sure. You'd need a clear mission, a well-defined set of goals, and you'd need a strong framework for command and control. Then you'd need a huge commitment from other countries in terms of troops, equipment, and funding. And maybe most importantly, you'd have to find a way to do all of that without triggering a larger conflict, which is a tough ask.
It sounds like a logistical and diplomatic nightmare, honestly. But shifting gears a bit, I was really struck by this report from SIPRIGRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They declared Ukraine the world's largest arms importer, which really highlights just how much military support they're getting from other countries.
Oh, absolutely. According to Sapere, Ukraine got more weapons in 2023 than any other country in the world, even more than big military powers like Saudi Arabia and India. That influx of weapons, all that military equipment, it really shows how committed the international community is to helping Ukraine defend itself.
But it does make you think about the long-term consequences of this whole arms buildup, right? Like what happens to all those weapons once the fighting stops? And is there a chance that all those weapons could actually make things worse, prolong the fighting or escalate it even further?
Those are important questions, and they really highlight the tricky situation of giving military aid in a conflict like this. The goal is to help Ukraine defend itself and to discourage more aggression. But you also don't want to fuel an arms race or create a situation where the conflict just becomes impossible to resolve.
It's a delicate balance, and it's impossible to know for sure what the long-term effects will be. But let's go back to the current situation for a minute. One of the articles focused on these recent Ukrainian drone attacks on that Russian oil refinery, which is pretty strategically important. That seems like a major escalation to me, but it also seems incredibly risky. What do you think Ukraine is trying to achieve with these bolder attacks?
Well, there are probably a few things going on there. First, by hitting targets inside Russia, Ukraine is showing that they can strike back, that they can project power beyond their own borders, right? It's a message to Russia and to everyone else that they're not just a passive victim in all of this.
So it's about showing that they can fight back, that they're not just taking those Russian attacks lying down. But wouldn't that also risk provoking Russia even more? I mean, attacking an oil refinery is a huge escalation.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the gamble Ukraine is taking. They're basically betting that these attacks will disrupt Russia's war effort enough to make the Kremlin rethink their whole strategy. But there's always a chance that Russia will respond with even more force, maybe targeting civilian infrastructure or escalating the conflict in other ways. It's a big risk.
It's a high-stakes gamble, that's for sure. And it shows just how unpredictable this whole thing is. Just when you think you've figured out what's going on, things change, and you're back to square one. Speaking of unpredictable, there was also this article about former President Trump's comments saying he might start sharing intelligence with Ukraine again if he's reelected. Now, you have to remember, this is the guy who was impeached for withholding aid to Ukraine. So this seems like a pretty big change, doesn't it?
It's definitely something to pay attention to, especially considering how important intelligence sharing is in this conflict. Like we talked about earlier, the U.S. has been a crucial source of intelligence for Ukraine. They've been providing valuable information about Russian troop movements, their strategies, their capabilities. That stuff can be a game changer on the battlefield.
Right, because that kind of intelligence can give Ukraine a tactical edge against a much larger and better equipped enemy. But what do you think is behind this potential shift from Trump? Is he really changing his mind, or is there something else going on here?
It's tough to say for sure, especially when it comes to politicians, right? But there are a couple of possibilities. Maybe, seeing what's happened in Ukraine, the devastation and all, maybe Trump has genuinely changed his mind. Maybe he really believes that supporting Ukraine is in the best interests of the U.S. now.
So maybe his priorities have shifted, or he's realized how important it is to support democracies when they're facing aggression. But wouldn't that be a pretty big reversal for him, considering his past stance?
It would be, yeah. But, Trump has never been afraid to change his position on things, sometimes pretty suddenly. The other possibility is that he's just trying to appeal to more voters. He knows that supporting Ukraine is a popular position now, even within the Republican Party. So maybe it's more about political strategy than anything else.
So maybe it's a political calculation, not a real change of heart.
It's possible. It's always important to think about the political context when you hear stuff like this. And speaking of political context, one of these articles also mentions some internal political changes in Belarus. They've appointed a new prime minister. Now, that might not seem directly related to the conflict in Ukraine, but Belarus has played a complicated role in this whole thing.
Oh, yeah, they've been a close ally of Russia throughout this whole conflict, right?
Yeah.
They even let Russian troops use their territory as staging ground for the invasion, but they haven't actually joined the fighting themselves. So what do you make of this leadership change? Could it affect the regional dynamics at all?
Well, it's hard to say for sure what this new prime minister will do. But anytime there's a leadership change in a country like Belarus, which is so closely tied to Russia, it's worth watching closely.
Right, especially since Belarus shares a border with both Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
And they've been letting those Russian troops operate from their territory. Do you think this new prime minister could change Belarus's position on the conflict at all?
Maybe, but it's important to remember that Belarus is still very much under Russia's influence politically and economically, so any major policy change would probably need Moscow's approval. But even small changes in Belarus's stance could have ripple effects on the conflict, for sure.
It's like another piece of this huge, complicated puzzle. And it reminds us that this whole thing isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. It's reshaping the entire geopolitical landscape. We've covered a lot of ground today, but honestly, it feels like we're just starting to understand how complicated this situation really is. There are so many moving parts, so many different players, so many possibilities. It can feel kind of overwhelming.
It is overwhelming, yeah. But it's also incredibly important to stay informed and engaged. The decisions being made right now, both on the battlefield and by world leaders, they're going to have consequences for years to come. It's something we all need to be paying attention to.
Absolutely, and that's exactly why we do these deep dives, right?
Hmm.
To try and make sense of this complex world we live in and to equip ourselves with the knowledge to navigate all these crazy times. But before we wrap things up for today, there's one more aspect of this conflict that I want to talk about, and that's the human cost. Yeah, we've talked about the military stuff, diplomacy, even the economic impacts, but it's easy to forget about the real people at the center of all of this, the people whose lives have been completely upended.
It's so important to remember that, right? Behind every headline, every statistic, there are human stories. Stories of loss, of resilience, of just not knowing what's going to happen next. We're talking about millions of people who've had to flee their homes, families that have been ripped apart. Their whole lives are on hold.
It's heartbreaking to think about what ordinary Ukrainians are going through. They're dealing with the threat of violence every single day, but they're also facing shortages of food, water, medicine, all the basic things they need. And then there's the mental and emotional toll, the trauma of living through a war, never knowing what the future holds.
And it's not just Ukrainians who are hurting. This war has had a huge impact on Russian citizens, too. I mean, many have lost family members in the fighting. Others are struggling with the economic fallout from the sanctions and the fact that Russia's been isolated from the rest of the world. It's tough.
It really hits home that war doesn't just affect the people fighting it, right? It has these ripple effects that touch so many lives, so many families, near and far. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical stuff, the strategies and all that, but we can't forget about the real people caught in the middle of all this.
I agree. It's easy to get desensitized to the human cost when you're constantly hearing about it on the news, seeing all the numbers. But we have to resist that. We have to keep those individual stories in mind.
So as we try to make sense of this whole thing, this conflict that keeps changing and evolving, we can't lose sight of that human dimension. The stories of bravery, of people finding ways to cope, and the stories of loss are just as important as all the military and political stuff. Because at the end of the day, the human cost is the real measure of what war does.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we've seen in this deep dive, the situation in Ukraine is anything but simple. There's so much going on, so many possible outcomes, that it's impossible to know for sure what will happen next.
Exactly. We've gone from the front lines in Kursk to those diplomatic meetings in Saudi Arabia, from the economic battlefield of sanctions to those debates about using frozen assets. And with each new thing that happens, the stakes just seem to get higher, the risks more serious.
That's why it's so important to stay informed, to really think critically about everything, to question your own assumptions and try to see things from different perspectives. The more we understand about how complicated this conflict is, the better prepared we'll be to deal with the challenges that come next.
It feels like we've put together this massive puzzle, but we're still missing some of the pieces, right? And the picture that's emerging, it's both fascinating and really unsettling. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. Given everything we've talked about today, all the possibilities, all the risks, all the human cost, what do you think the next 6 months hold for Ukraine and for the rest of the world?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer, but it's something we all need to be thinking about because the decisions that are made over the next few months, they're going to shape what happens for years to come.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.